is Reverend Dr. Columba Stewart of the Order of St. Benedict, who is professor of theology at St. John's University School of Theology in Minnesota and executive director of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library. He is currently writing a history of monasticism in the Christian East and the West during the first millennium and directing an acclaimed research project to digitize endangered manuscripts in areas of conflict in Africa, the Middle East, and India.
Good morning, dear brothers and sisters. I will leave my greeting at that to avoid the minefield of ranks, titles, and so on represented in the room. This is one of the more complicated ecclesiastical geographies I've ever negotiated. My special warm thanks to Father Stephanos and then to Robin Darling-Young for the invitation to be with you this morning. And it's a particular joy for me to be speaking in the same session as my fellow Texan, Father Justin. So we'll be speaking about the role of digital technology in preservation and access of ancient manuscripts, doing it from his perspective as working with a single library, from my perspective as working with multiple libraries and a number of different religious traditions. So my apologies that we don't have this screen over here operating. The verbal commentary should be sufficient, but normally I use images in a presentation of this kind because we work with images. And perhaps also we've reached the point in the morning where some visual distraction would be welcome from the high-level theological information we've been receiving. So with that, let's begin. One of the issues in manuscript study in the Western Academy is that much of our knowledge of Eastern Christianity, Greek is a partial exception but not entirely an exception, is based on manuscripts that were brought to major European and later North American libraries during the colonial era, when Europeans and Americans would go to the Near East and even to Eastern Europe and other places essentially on scholarly shopping expeditions. And they would look for deposits of manuscripts, the Catholics looking at old manuscripts for their own theological and polemical purposes, the Protestants looking for manuscripts to find early versions of the scriptures as part of their theological agenda. And so much of the scholarship that has been written since and our supposed awareness of these traditions is based solely on the manuscripts which have been in these Western libraries, beginning in the 17th century and then afterwards. So thus, for example, in Syriac, the Vatican, the British Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale, the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, these are the sources for so much of what we think we know. And so here's a great example of Joseph Assamani presenting Syriac manuscripts from Egypt to Pope Clement XI, who says, "Put them over there," as he accumulates the wonderful treasures. You have to see the image to know what I was just referring to, as he begins to accumulate the wonderful treasures that now constitute the Vatican Library. There were people already in the 19th century who were thinking about what to do with the manuscripts that they couldn't get. So an example of this would be Agnes Smith Lewis, one of the famous Sisters of Sinai, who with her sisters spent time in the Near East looking for ancient manuscripts. They were very learned, they knew languages. They would occasionally buy something when it was for sale. But when they met the monks of Sinai and some other locations, this was no longer an option, or not an option at all. So they pioneered the use of photography in creating copies of manuscripts in distant locations, which could then be reproduced using lithographic or other printing techniques. And so here she is working on a manuscript in one of her efforts to apply a reagent, a chemical reagent, to make the manuscript more legible, which had a very short-term effect. But she and her sister were pioneers in these various techniques of study, and I honor them here for their photographic work. Another example of such an effort is the Peshitta project, the Syriac Bible project, which formerly was at the University of Leiden in Holland, now at the Free University in Amsterdam, who went through the Near East photographing important Syriac biblical manuscripts before the recent troubles. And I show this particular manuscript from Baghdad, last seen in Baghdad, which I in fact used for some of my own research, which is now missing, thanks to the chaos of the 2003 invasion of Iraq and some of the subsequent problems there. All we have left of this one is the microfilm. And I'm fairly confident in saying that it didn't just disappear, it probably was actually physically destroyed for reasons I can explain privately. So faced with such challenges and needs, the logical thing ought to be to call a monk. And so that's why Father Justin and I are the ones who are speaking in this session. Now, you can copy a manuscript, as of course we used to do, and this was not an exclusively monastic enterprise by any means, but it's much faster if you use a camera. So one of the true pioneer of our project was Father Oliver Kapsner, who was a monk of my monastery, who in the early 1960s conceived a project to microfilm monastic, initially Benedictine manuscripts in Austria, which some of you are old enough to remember was a neutral country during the Cold War and was potentially a kind of frontline country should there have been a ground war between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. And of course, this was also the nuclear era when everything might get destroyed in a nuclear conflict. So Father Oliver got the idea of going to these monasteries to microfilm their manuscripts just in case. There had been the losses of the two world wars. There was this very real threat, it seemed to us at the time, of a nuclear conflict. And so there they are, the mobile microfilming studio and that great old VW bus that some of us remember as the sort of thing you drove to California with a surfboard sticking out the back. But in this case, there was a microfilm camera. And so you see Father Oliver and the local technicians working through a pile of medieval Latin manuscripts. In this, they were, of course, following a great Benedictine tradition, pioneered by Jean Mabillon and the other monks of the Marist Benedictine congregation, which was an early modern reforming congregation in France, which was particularly known for its scholarly endeavors. So essentially inventing the science of paleography as we know it today, publishing the first modern, somewhat critical editions of Latin texts and later Greek texts based on the manuscripts that they gathered during their voyage littéraire. So they would get on a donkey and they'd go around to villages throughout Europe looking for manuscripts. Now they were doing this in a time when printing had become well established as the means for propagating texts, but manuscripts were still sitting around. And so they sometimes acquired them and took them to their monastery at Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris. Other times they copied them, unfortunately using the old-fashioned laborious technique of copying by hand. And it is that library at Saint-Germain-des-Prés which then was the basis for their publishing activities. And also, after the Revolution, was the basis for the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. So with that inspiration for the work that we do, let me tell you a little bit about how we do our work in places far beyond the Austria that Father Oliver was involved in at the start. When we find a library that's willing to work with us, we photograph every manuscript. We don't cherry pick the things that we think are interesting. We assume that we need to leave room for scholars later to have different kinds of interests. We prefer to cover regions, geographical, cultural regions, rather than isolated collections. So it's not just a little showcase where you have some manuscripts from this language and then some manuscripts from that language. The intention is really to have substantial, broad, and deep collections reflecting these various languages and cultures. We have from the outset trained and employed local workers. So it's a kind of economic opportunity, particularly in regions where we tend to work these days where such opportunities are few. Our promise is that we will safely archive the images and that we will, with their permission, share them online. And then one of the things that we have also been able to do, sadly, is to provide some tracking of changing status of collections. As things are moved, as other things are destroyed, and some of the Ethiopian work we did already in the 1970s, manuscripts which are now found in private collections outside of Ethiopia. And I'll show an example of that later. So to give you an idea of where it went after Father Oliver, I mentioned Ethiopia in the 70s, but since 2003, we've been working in places like this, still working in Europe, but you can see that the axis has shifted somewhat to the east. Extensive work in the Middle East in a number of countries which have gone through considerable turmoil in the last 20 years. Working in Africa with both Christian and Muslim communities, and the same in South Asia, working with the historic St. Thomas Christians of Southwest India and Kerala state, as well as with Persian tradition Muslims in the north, and then recently in Nepal, a first effort at a project based on manuscripts from Buddhist and Hindu traditions. So let's do the travel part of the program because this is the most interesting. We've had a strong emphasis on what you might call historic Mesopotamia, because this is a place where you find ancient Syriac Christian communities, which are this very special form of Christian tradition and theology in a kind of Semitic linguistic environment. And this is also an area which has had considerable cultural contact in ancient times as well as today. And so here you are looking into Syria from Mardin, Turkey, remembering that there are now borders where there were not borders in earlier times. Among the wonderful treasures in this region, which is being depopulated of Christians, as is so much of the Middle East, is a collection of manuscripts in Diyarbakir, which is the flashpoint of the Turkish-Kurdish conflict. So most stories about Kurdish nationalists in Turkey come from Diyarbakir. This is ancient Amida or Amid. So here's a 6th century gospel book with an extraordinary portrait of Christ, which is simply sitting there in a church which has a few dozen families still worshiping there in a town of over 100,000 people. They're the only Christians left. Mardin, Turkey, we saw the view from there just a moment ago. Again, very important Christian town historically, an ancient fortress, as you can see from the topography. Now a town of 75,000, mostly Kurds, less than 100 Christians. But tucked in churches and monasteries there are treasures like this, a 13th century gospel book. This is actually the Gospel of John, and up above it you have the Pentecost story. And other examples of Syriac illumination, as well as very important copies of early texts in Syriac, as well as in Garshuni, which is Arabic written in Syriac script, and then a handful of Arabic, Turkish, and other manuscripts. We worked extensively in Aleppo until the civil war in Syria, mostly in Aleppo. So here's the great citadel before the conflict. Here's what happened to the famous monuments of Aleppo as a result of the war. The not quite destruction, but serious damage done to the beautiful Umayyad Mosque. Christian churches which found themselves right on the dividing line between the pro-government and the anti-government forces in Syria. So the Greek Catholic Archbishopric on the left, where I used to stay, that's also where I would celebrate the liturgy on Sundays. The Armenian Orthodox Cathedral to the right, which was very heavily damaged in the conflict. We worked with the manuscript collections associated with both of these churches and other ones in Aleppo as well, including the Syriac Orthodox Church, whose leader, Mar Gregorios Johanna Ibrahim, was kidnapped in 2013 and never heard from again, along with, as many of you know, the Antiochian Orthodox bishop in Aleppo, Bulos Yazigi, who was also kidnapped in the same incident. So there are real tragedies affecting these ancient communities, and it has been our privilege to work with them, ideally before the conflict, but in some cases afterwards. And the lesson we've learned is you never know when something's going to happen. We've also worked quite a bit in Iraq, in the so-called Nineveh Triangle in the north. That's been the major center for what we've done. And you can see it's got Mosul to the west, Erbil to the east, so a pretty interesting neighborhood. And precisely the one that, of course, was taken over by ISIS in 2014. Very interesting local traditions, local art, this 18th century gospel book with the story of Christ, St. Thomas, and St. Peter. It's really interesting stuff, as well, of course, as copies of important texts. Our partner there has been Father Najib Mikael, now the Archbishop of Mosul for the Chaldean Catholics. And here we are in 2012, before the Troubles, standing above the Nineveh plain, in other words, the plain of Jonah, near to ancient Nineveh, the city, which of course is now modern Mosul. In 2014, you'll remember Mosul fell in June, and then the Christian villages such as Karakosh, which are between Mosul and Erbil, fell in August, the Feast of the Transfiguration. The Christians of Karakosh had to flee 40 miles to Erbil through the Iraqi summer. Following that, we saw the destruction of things like the magnificent Assyrian monuments at Nimrud, destroyed with barrel bombs and bulldozers. The monastery of Mar Behnam, a Syriac Catholic monastery with an important manuscript collection, with its shrines to Mar Behnam and Mar Sera, destroyed by bombs, videoed and streamed online by ISIS as part of its very sophisticated media operation. Returning to Karakosh in 2017, after it had been recovered, we found a remnant of our project there in this metadata sheet from the place where the studio had been. Now, the good news is the manuscripts had already been removed because, as sometimes happens, local people felt something was coming. And so they had removed the manuscript safely to Erbil, and while equipment and so on was destroyed in that sudden occupation, fortunately the manuscripts there were not. That's not the case in Mosul, where some very significant manuscript collections were destroyed because they had no time to take them out when suddenly the forces of the Islamic State showed up at the gates. And just one thing, this is for Professor Robin Darling-Young, of course, is a very interesting discovery that I made last summer of a previously unknown copy of a letter of Evagrius to Melania, one of his more speculative works. And there were only 2 known copies, both in the British Library, neither one perfectly complete. And here's one much later, showing that some of these works, which were presumed to have fallen out of favor because of changing theological tides or controversies, in fact continued to be studied. So what do we not yet know about some of these places and traditions? We have worked in Ethiopia, as I mentioned earlier, and we've gone back recently to work at the monastery of Abba Garima in Tigray province. And you see the great rock of the monastery. This is probably one of those places which has always been a holy place as it moves through successive religious groups, now a Christian monastery. And it was our privilege in 2013 to work on the Abba Garima Gospels, which are thought to be the earliest Ethiopic manuscripts, with very interesting illumination showing the obvious influence of Byzantine and Syriac iconography, but also expressing the African context with the kind of groovy leopard skin print on the throne, and so on. We have also worked with churches of the Byzantine tradition, which of course I need to highlight here since I'm an interloper in this conference on Byzantine monasticism. Our first project in Lebanon actually was at Balamand, and it was at the time when the patriarch was then the abbot of the monastery at Balamand. So working with mostly Arabic, but some Greek manuscripts. We've also worked with Slavonic manuscripts in Western Ukraine. So the Stefanik National Research Library in Lviv, and so here you see its collection, which is all the manuscripts taken from the religious houses during the Soviet era. So these would be largely Ukrainian Greek Catholic collections, so Slavonic Byzantine material, but also this was essentially a Polish city until the war. And so a number of Latin religious communities, all of their manuscripts, along with the haunting Torah scrolls of what was at one time one of the most significant Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, are now in the Stefanik Library. We are also currently digitizing the personal library of Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, whom, of course, most of you know of, one of the great scholars of the mid-20th century and a heroic figure for the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. We also have been working closely with Bishop Jovan of Pakrac, a Serbian Orthodox bishop based in Croatia, in an effort to recover pockets of Serbian manuscripts located throughout the former Yugoslavia, including the very interesting and important collection at Cetinje Monastery in Montenegro. And so here's the abbot. I took a group there one Sunday, and we had just a wonderful, wonderful time. I want to note the fact that we also do work with Muslim communities. And this work began in Jerusalem when we had worked with a Syriac Orthodox monastery about 200 yards perhaps from the Temple Mount Arama Sharif on their collection. And a Muslim family who were one of the early and established families of Jerusalem asked if we could do their collection as well. And the initial response, well, we do Christian things, we don't really have expertise. And then we decided that these communities had lived alongside each other for centuries. They interacted regularly, they did business together, they went to weddings and funerals together. Their manuscript culture should also exist digitally in a similar environment. So we worked with the Buderi family, who have a house right at that gate. And this is the view from the digitizing studio in their home. So it's pretty impressive, $1 million view. Also one of the hottest points of conflict in the religious landscape of the Near East. So very important that culture there is saved. And then our largest project currently is in Mali, West Africa. There's the River Niger, which is the lifeblood of the whole country, working with manuscripts related to Timbuktu, many of which, as you know from stories of the actually, there are children in the room, so I won't use the name of a popular book about the librarian describing how bad blank he is. But there was a man who felt that something was coming, as in Iraq, and evacuated most of the manuscripts of Timbuktu before the arrival of Islamist jihadis in Timbuktu in the northern regions in 2012. So thousands of those metal boxes, like you just saw, filled with almost 400,000 documents, some of them books, many pamphlets, letters, archival materials, currently being digitized thanks to Abdul Qadir Haidara, the aforementioned librarian, in a large project in the capital. We also more recently have been working in Timbuktu itself with the collections of the 3 major mosques which were hidden in 2012 because they said, we know how to hide things from trouble. We hid them from the Moroccans, we hid them from the French, we can hide them from this. And so we're working in those mosques as well. Very difficult conditions. We have to be in the town with armed guard. We have to stay in the UN camp. We had some troubles on our first visit, which I've related in another venue. But it's a very exciting project employing 20 young Malians who would not otherwise have a job because there's nothing else happening in Timbuktu. The same can be said of many of the Christian communities in the Middle East, where it's also very difficult for young Christians to find employment. All right, so how does this look? And I'm nearing the end here. When you look at the countries we worked in the Middle East with Christian manuscript collections, you can see a number of different collections, a number of manuscripts, about 21,000 complete manuscripts digitized in those various countries, and representing all of the linguistic traditions of Eastern Christianity of that region. If anybody wants this data in actual form or a copy of this thing, I'm happy to share it later. This is what I call the money slide, because this gets the funders, the foundations, to support our work, because they say, okay, how big a deal is this? And so we tell them what the great libraries of Europe and North America that I opened with, the ones that have been the basis of everything we think we know about Eastern Christianity. What they have in actual manuscripts in these various languages, it totals something under 9,000. And when you think about all the places we've worked, including Ethiopia, other locations, it adds up to almost 41,000. So think of the potential graduate students for finding something really cool that nobody else has seen yet, and it could be yours. Although you have to share it with everybody else who can see it online. So what happens to the images? They come to our monastery, which is a very beautiful place in central Minnesota. We have a prep school, we have a university, we have a seminary, we have a publishing house, an ecumenical research institute, a lot going on, and this is what it looks like in summer, and that's winter. And we're also the home of extraordinarily important buildings designed by the Bauhaus architect Marcel Breuer. And we have the largest collection of Breuer buildings in the world. This is the Great Abbey Church, one of the great churches of the 20th century. It's not to everybody's taste. It's not very Byzantine, but for me it works, right? I was professed in that church. I was ordained in that church. I'm in that church several times a day. And the magnificent library designed by Breuer, which serves as the university library, and then our Himmel, as we call it, Hill Museum and Manuscript Library attached to it. And so there's our reading room, recently renovated thanks to generous benefactors, where we regularly have scholars coming to research. And thanks to Dumbarton Oaks, and I know there are a lot of DO people in the room, we've been able to host a summer language school in Syriac and Coptic and Armenian the last few years to prepare a new generation of young scholars to work with the manuscripts found in our digital collections and elsewhere. You can access them online. We have something called vHimmel, which is virtual Himmel. It sounds kind of like a German rocket, I know, vHimmel, but it really is virtual Himmel. And we are putting things online as quickly as we can, thanks to our team of catalogers. A recent large grant for the National Endowment for the Humanities is really helping with this. And we currently have, I think, about 40,000 manuscripts online from all different traditions, lots more to come, and also a number of records there from our legacy microfilm collections from the era of Father Oliver and others in Europe. And I mentioned earlier the changing status of a collection, so here's how we can flag in an individual manuscript record if the manuscript is still there, if it's been destroyed, and so on. And we have found examples in our work, such as this one. Actually, we'll get to that one. So you go to Ethiopia today, you're offered manuscripts for sale. They're in hotel gift shops, they're along the roadside. I'm there in 2005, turned up this is the ancient pre-Aksumite capital of Ethiopia. Here are 3 kids learning how to read Ge'ez using a manuscript, because they still use manuscripts in the parish because they don't have a printed copy of whatever else it is. The monk around the corner you don't see in this picture has the printed copy. He has the good one, and he lets the kids use the manuscript. So somebody shows up, and they say, I'll give you $50 for that. $50 is a lot of money in Ethiopia. And they say, well, we have the printed copy. We don't need it. So there it goes. Well, sometimes it's more valuable. So here's an example of a manuscript that we microfilmed in 1979. It's a 15th century manuscript of what we might call Old Testament pseudepigrapha, but for Ethiopians, it's the Old Testament. So the Book of Enoch and other writings, now held by a private collector in Scandinavia. And those of you with keen eyes can see that under provenance is the name of a dealer. Not a monastery, not a location, not a date of legal export. This was not legally removed from the country. We also have on our vHimmel site, vHimmel School, which will help you with paleography in Latin, Syriac, and Arabic, particularly Christian Arabic, thanks to images of manuscripts from Sinai, in fact, from the microfilms. And soon will come Armenian. So you'll be able to learn the different stages of the writing, have little tests and quizzes. It's a lot of fun if you get into that, and a lot of people in this room get into that. So check it out. So a word of thanks to our funders who make all of this possible. Plato has been invoked earlier today. We are the Platonic form of a not-for-profit organization. So we rely on foundations like this as well as generous individuals. And I believe we may have some in the room, in fact, who have supported our work. So shout out to all of them. And finally, here are the URLs to check out. It's easy, hmml.org, vhmml.org. And we have very active social media channels, thanks to people besides me. So follow us on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. A lot of beautiful images, updates about the projects, and cool stuff that the catalogers have found. And with that, I'll end. Thank you.